Hi there, I'm Erik Paulsen, chair of the Institute for Gene Therapies, and I'm happy to welcome Christina Hartman to this edition of Faces of Gene Therapy. Christina is the head of government affairs for Orchard Therapeutics and has a long career as a biotech government affairs professional. Christina is also a rare disease advocate and mother whose personal and professional worlds intersect in the fight to advance treatments for individuals and families living with unmet medical needs and navigating the many challenges that come along the way. Christina, thanks so much for joining me today. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Eric. Happy to be here.
Well, as you know, gene therapies do hold the promise of one time, potentially curative treatment, but only if patients can access them. What policy changes are needed to ensure that costs, the reimbursement, and insurance barriers aren't turning scientific progress into inequity?
Question. And, Eric, I think it's really different than what people often assume. I'm currently on my second gene therapy company. I came into this space because of my youngest daughter, Charlotte, and my desire to eventually, hopefully, have a gene therapy for her. The reality of the space is, particularly when it comes to rare pediatric disease, it's difficult to incentivize companies to enter and to stay into this space. People are often misled by price tags. They'll focus on the multi-million dollar cost of a gene therapy rather than the value that it provides and the very small patient populations that we actually end up seeing treated. It's very different than the assets that traditional pharma has focused on, where it might be a lower cost therapy, but there's a massive market for it. And the potential profitability is much larger than you would ever see with a high cost gene therapy. So it's difficult to incentivize companies to invest in something where you will not have a massive return ever, despite the individual higher price tag. And I think that policymakers in Washington are starting to understand that important distinction. Some of the real policy barriers that we've seen, particularly for these rare pediatric populations, is many of them are covered by Medicaid. And so we deal, at least in my experience, primarily with commercial payers and Medicaid. When it comes to the commercial payers, they've been recognizing the value, covering these therapies, not delaying at all, not wasting any time. When it comes to the state Medicaids, we have seen significant delays. When I was at Bluebird Bio, where we had 3 approved gene therapies, one for beta thalassemia, one for cerebral adrenoleukodystrophy, another for sickle cell disease, we were seeing delays of 6 to 24 months for those Medicaid patients. They were not receiving the same timely access to therapy as their commercially insured counterparts. Here at Orchard Therapeutics, where we have a one single gene therapy, Linmeldy, for metachromatic leukodystrophy, which is a rare disorder. We anticipate that we'd be able to treat 40 to 50 kids a year if we could find them in time in the United States. And with newborn screening now hopefully coming online, I think that we will start to find some of these kids in time to treat. But those same delays will actually be deadly for those patients. If you were to wait 6 to 24 months, most of those kids wouldn't make it long enough to be treated. So we've been working closely with states, with their elected officials, with their Medicaid programs to make sure when we identify a child that they're able to make sure the hospital is made whole. And that entails not just the coverage of the drug product, but all the ancillary care and services required to deliver it. And we are seeing significant delays for the Medicaid patients and significant barriers as compared with their commercially insured counterparts. And so we were recently at CMS speaking with officials, and some of the things that we had requested and that we're hoping to see happen over the next year is following the passage of the Accelerating Kids Access to Care Act. We'd like to see CMS work with states, provide guidance to state Medicaid programs as to how they can streamline that credentialing of out-of-state Medicaid providers. That's a significant issue that we've dealt with. We currently have 7 qualified treatment centers that we can treat patients at, which means they have to often cross state lines. So if they're a Medicaid patient, the providers at the hospital that they're being treated at have to get credentialed into their state Medicaid program. And that has been a significant barrier with significant delays. place. So we'd really like to see CMS work with states and provide some of the guidance to implement that Accelerating Kids Access to Care Act, which was a, as you know, bipartisan, bicameral effort recently passed into law earlier this year. We also would really like to see additional CMS guidance to ensure that states are aware of the existing federal requirements for separate and adequate reimbursement of the gene therapy drug costs, as well as the ancillary care and services. That's another thing that is unique to some of these autologous ex vivo gene therapies, the ability to pay separately for the drug product and the ancillary care and services, and making sure that states are aware of what currently exists under federal law. And then finally, at the request of CMS, we made sure that our value-based arrangement is available to state Medicaid programs underneath their multiple best price reporting option. And we haven't really seen states taking advantage of this. And so we would like to see CMS provide additional guidance to states about the opportunity to access this. Most states want to utilize their own contracts and not necessarily what's in the CMS portal. So would really like to see CMS provide guidance on that as well.
Yeah, that's great. And you kind of touched on this, or leads up into sort of another thought or question. In your view, how should Congress right now be addressing disparities so that access to gene therapy, it doesn't depend on a family's income or education or their ability to fight the system?
So that's a great question. Honestly, the ability to access gene therapy is based on your ability to get to a hospital. So that has been one of the most significant barriers. I know Congress has considered recently a safe harbor for travel and lodging assistance to patients who are publicly insured. Right now, companies have to work with the Office of the Inspector General to receive an opinion to provide travel and lodging assistance to publicly insured patients. That's something that Congress could do that would really streamline the ability, particularly of smaller companies, to come into the space. That's an added cost and requirement that doesn't need to be there. There's really no inducement for people to receive a gene therapy. They're quite sick. They're not going to go through this process otherwise if there's any alternative. So that's something I think Congress could do. The other thing that I would like to see them look at is making sure that people have access across borders for whatever support they require. In my own experience, I know we were talking earlier about my daughter Charlotte, but the patchwork of assistance in this country is really location based. So when they're under 18, much of the assistance that they receive is through their school system. Sometimes they will qualify for Medicaid or for a waiver or for different programs, but funds are very, very limited, and there's not enough to go around for all those sick, dying, and disabled children who require it. So I would like to see Congress make sure that children are able to access the care and services that they require, no matter what state they live in, no matter what state they move to. There shouldn't be a gap in coverage. And we need to adequately fund all of these programs. There shouldn't be a waiting list for sick, dying, and disabled children, which there currently is in many states.
Sure. Well, you've got a great background in this area and a great viewpoint. So, for those who are experiencing, how delays in their diagnosis or coverage barriers and fragmented care can limit outcomes, what are the most urgent legislative fixes needed to ensure that patients aren't missing that narrow window where gene therapies can actually be really effective?
So I think one of the other bills that has recently come to fruition that we've been working on through multiple Congresses is Medicaid coverage for genomic sequencing. And this is something that has been a bipartisan priority, I think, for 5 or 6 years now, has never actually made it into law. We've been very focused on newborn screening, which is that underpinning that you need to have, where if we can diagnose a child at birth, it's something important for MLD, then you'll be able to treat them in time. But beyond that, there are some diseases that present later on that can't be caught by newborn screening, but can be found through genomic sequencing, whether it's whole genome or whole exome sequencing. My own daughter was diagnosed via whole exome sequencing at 2.5 years old. If we are able to make sure that families can access that testing, that Medicaid is covering that testing, you are going to give families answers so that they can find their disease community, create the nonprofits to create natural history studies, and make sure you have patient populations that will incentivize the biopharmaceutical industry to bring bring treatments to these patients.
Given your experience across government and advocacy and industry, what specific legislative actions would most accelerate the path from diagnosis to treatment for those rare disease patients? And most importantly, also, what happens if Congress fails to take action now?
Well, I think the most important thing that Congress can do is really fund a lot of this, particularly when it comes to newborn screening. We've seen that the funding provided to CDC and HRSA for newborn screening has been level set at about 20 million a year for each of those agencies for 5 to 7 years now. That level funding is not supporting the necessary implementation of newborn screening for all the conditions that have been approved by that recommended uniform screening panel. There are a number of conditions that are currently delayed in a number of states, and those babies who are not being screened and not caught in time cannot be treated with these gene therapies. If we can't identify a child in time, we can't treat. And the way that we have often been identifying children to date, the way some of the other parents have put it to me, is they feel like they are sacrificing an older sibling who will be diagnosed when they're too far progressed to treat. They die, but then their younger sibling is diagnosed because of the older one. So they feel like they're sacrificing one child to save another, and they effectively are. But we'd like to make it so you don't have to go through that you are diagnosed via newborn screening. We have the technology now. We just need the investment to accelerate the implementation of the screening for these kids so that they can be treated when they're caught early enough.
Yeah, and there's no doubt that your advocacy for newborn screening and passionate advocacy on that side is really making a difference. And you touched on this earlier too, but how important is incentivizing investment in gene therapies, but particularly for rare pediatric diseases? Because, I guess what's it actually going to take to make these curative treatments a reality for those populations?
Well, Eric, I know this is something we've talked about a lot. This is what keeps me up at night, is I don't think that we have the incentives that we need, particularly for rare pediatric disease. When I came into this space several years ago, there were many companies. There was a lot of excitement. Over the years, we've just seen companies dropping out. Some of the larger ones who are still very invested in the space are mainly concerned about the ability to use gene therapy for larger populations, for more common disorders. And that is exciting, and I hope we get there. But the reality of the space right now is the process for gene therapies like ours, where we have 15 years of data, primarily because it took so long to identify the kids, get them into a trial, and go through to approval. But that 15 years of data is the single longest data set for a gene therapy that I'm aware of in the entire world. So, we have that information, but what people don't really understand a lot of the time is that the process you use to administer an autologous ex vivo gene therapy, in our case, an HSC gene therapy, is the child goes into the hospital. They go through a process called apheresis, where they're hooked up to a big machine. They extract their blood stem cells. We send those out for genetic modification, and the manufacturing occurs with that patient's own cells. Meanwhile, the patient undergoes myoablative conditioning or chemotherapy with busulfan. It's a brutal process, what someone with cancer would go through. The cells then come back. The medicine is infused via a hematopoietic stem cell transplant, and that child is in the hospital for weeks into months as their immune system rebuilds, as the medicine engrafts, and their life changes. And it's amazing and wonderful. But I think a lot of people don't see that journey and how tough it is. One of the other things I'm concerned about is, as the mother of a child with a neurodevelopmental condition, to have that engraftment process. Many of these neurodevelopmental kids, they cannot sit still. They cannot maintain their bodily integrity. My daughter will pull her own hair out. She'll rip and chew her clothes. We go through multiple items of clothing a day. You would literally have to sedate her to go through that kind of process. So the science is at the very beginning. It still needs to evolve, particularly in terms of administration of the therapy. And if we don't succeed with what we have now and see even further investment, I don't think we'll make progress. And so I'm most concerned about the ability to treat the sick, dying, and disabled children. And we've barely scratched the surface of that. We've identified 11,000 rare disorders through genomic sequencing and other ways. And we've developed treatments for maybe 5% of those. I think that's the commonly cited number. Only 5% of disorders of human disease has a single FDA approved treatment. So we really need to keep the pressure on to keep innovating, particularly when it comes to delivery. And the most untapped area, I think, is delivery into the brain. I'll never forget Charlotte's neurogeneticist saying to me, well, there is the one gene therapy, which we've seen for AADC, and that had given me a lot of hope. But she said they were able to identify the particular region of the brain responsible for movement, which in that disorder was the primary cause for concern. And that's why it worked. But when you have disorders of the brain that are systemic through the entire nervous system, we haven't figured out a way to get that proliferation throughout the brain. So there's a lot further that we have to go. And if we don't see success in these gene therapies that we have now, I don't think we will ever evolve to that point. So we've barely scratched the surface, which is what I think a lot of people don't realize.
Well, this has been a very informative conversation, and we just really appreciate your experience, your passion, your knowledge, looking for continued solutions in the gene therapy space. So, thanks for taking the time to join us today.
Of course. Thank you.
That's